earlier we talked about the monetary and the federal stimulus that we've seen all over the world, really. How concerned are you about an exit strategy, about winding down some of the stimulus packages around the world? And, some people, particularly as it relates to the United States, worry that the Federal Reserve will have to start tightening, raising interest rates at a time that unemployment will be in the double digits, 10%.
Well, at the G20 this week, we're encouraging leaders to start to think about exit strategies, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The first thing is to make sure that the stimulus measures that have been put in place get fully delivered, and we do see the recovery in the economy that is less fragile, more sustained, more private sector investment driving it. It's important we continue to deliver stimulus. But you're absolutely right. At some point, those countries, particularly countries that are highly indebted or have engaged in expansionary monetary policies, are going to have to figure out ways to start to ease out of that, and ways that avoid inflation and obviously avoid some of the problems with higher interest rates and debt spirals. Canada, very fortunately, as I say, is not in that position. Obviously, our interest rates are low, but we haven't yet embarked on money creation per se. I forget what the technical term for that is, but we haven't engaged in that, and our deficits are high by recent standards. Compared to the rest of the world, they're low, and our debt levels are very low. So our exit will be relatively smooth, but we are concerned about some other countries. They should think about that, but not think about it at the expense of getting through this crisis.
How important are these meetings this week in terms of the G20, the UN General Assembly? What would it take for you to walk away from the meetings to say, this was a real success? What would you like to achieve?
Well, the G20 meeting, I think, is the big one in terms of the economy. I hope we continue to see a focus on the economy and a willingness, as I say, to deliver stimulus, fight protectionism, and fix the financial sector. Get toxic assets off the balance sheets and provide a system of prudent regulation, good solid domestic regulations with some kind of international peer review that will allow us to have sustainable growth in the future. I think that would, whether we'll see all that, but I hope we at least have that focus at the G20.
I believe it was a report from S&P saying that the Canadian economy will turn positive in the third quarter, but it also expects that the recovery will be slow because consumers have yet to ramp up spending and businesses remain cautious. Do you believe we'll see growth return?
Well, we actually saw some growth in June. We believe there'll be growth in the last half of this year. It will be modest growth. I think there should continue to be growth in 2010, and probably stronger growth. But look, we're still speculating at this point. I think we should be very cautious. That's the approach we're taking. The fundamentals of the Canadian economy are sound, but obviously we are dependent hugely on the export market to the United States. So we're watching. Obviously we're watching the developments here very carefully, and some of the tentativeness and growth here as well.
So that's really the sticking point, the export market to the United States, because the U.S. consumer is sort of sluggish still.
Well, but that's really where Canada got hit. We were about a year later falling into the recession than the United States. Eventually, just the sheer impact of the American consumer on our exports affected us and put us into a deep downturn in the beginning part of this year. Look, I don't think the American consumer will ever be as strong as he or she was in the past. In fact, I agree with President Obama that we cannot hinge future world growth simply on an overspending American consumer. That is not a wise strategy, but that's certainly not the strategy of the government of Canada. We have had relatively good, stable consumer situation in our country, and we're trying to diversify our export markets as well. We're signing a lot of trade deals with other countries to ensure we're not simply dependent on the American consumer.
What other countries are most important right now in terms of those relationships and tapping into the consumer base around the world?
We've signed trade deals with 8 new countries, including many in our hemisphere. The most important thing we have going right now is we're actually engaged in economic partnership talks with the European Union. Canada has been trying for decades to get some kind of a trade or economic partnership deal with the European Union. We're finally in discussions with them. So obviously for us that's a very important initiative. After our free trade agreement with the United States, this would be clearly the most important thing any Canadian government's done on the trade front in a very long time.
And of course we just saw positive GDP showings in France and Germany. You think that's sustainable?
Yeah, I do, but the same cautions I have elsewhere. We have to continue with stimulus. We have to make sure private investment recovers. We have to watch protectionism. and we do have to make sure we've got a well-regulated, not over-regulated, but well-regulated financial sector in the future.
We're going to have Václav Klaus on shortly,
Right.
the president of the Czech Republic. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the policy shift from the U.S. in terms of the missiles in the Czech Republic and Poland.
Well, I don't know that I do have strong views. Look, we're a NATO ally. Czech Republic, United States are obviously both strong allies of Canada, and we're in a continental, through NORAD and continental defense arrangement with the United States. We're anxious to always be helpful in terms of our shared, as Canadians and Americans, our shared world security priorities. It was always a controversial initiative. I would hope, and I have no reason to believe it represents in any way an America that is retreating from its security responsibilities. The previous decisions were controversial. So I hope it does improve, obviously, our relationship as an alliance with the Russians without in any way jeopardizing the longer-term security concerns that we share with the United States.
Mr. Prime Minister, so nice to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me back.
We so appreciate your time today. And thank you for coming to the New York Stock Exchange and visiting us.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Canadian Prime Minister.